Okay, hello everybody and welcome on 99 Media. Today I'm here with Matteo and we've got the great honor of having with us Professor Gabriel Rockhill, who is a philosopher, a cultural critic and activist who publishes in French and English. His work is dedicated to a materialist analysis of the social totality, and it has thus far focused primarily on the three intertwining themes of history, politics and culture. He's author of numerous publications and is also one of the most prominent intellectuals that is engaged in the translation in English of the work of Domenico Losurdo, as he recently edited the English translation of his work on Western Marxism, which is the topic of today's conversation. Gabriel also recently published the first of a 3-volume series for Monthly Review. The series is entitled The Intellectual War, Marxism versus the Imperial Theory Industry. And the first volume, which I think has just been published, is entitled Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism? So thank you very much, first of all, Gabriel, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me on. And just a tiny minor correction, the book is complete, but it's actually going to be published in December, the first volume called Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism.
It will be published on the Monthly Review, right?
Yeah, exactly. It'll be out in December 2025.
Okay, so by the way, I advise the audience to check the Monthly Review website because there's a lot of interesting articles relating to Marxism, very accessible, most of it free. So by all means, go check it out. It's really nice. And in this afternoon, we will be talking also with the director of the Monthly Review, John Bellamy Foster, at 4:30. So if you enjoy these themes, please be welcome here.
Please come back.
Yes. And we can start with the first question.
All right.
Can go.
So to start, Gabriel, could you define Western Marxism for us? I assume your definition builds on two key texts, Perry Anderson's Consideration on Western Marxism, 1976, very famous book, and also Domenico Losurdo's Il Marxismo Occidentale, which you recently translated. As a first question, could you clarify if the term Western Marxism is it to be conceived as a mere geographic label, or does it also point to theoretical shifts within Marxism itself? And what would you say are its main characteristics? Also, if you could focus on what you defined the 4 retreats that Western Marxism undertook in its history.
So Western Marxism is really the dominant form of Marxism that's developed in the imperial core, so especially in Western Europe and the United States. And its deeper historical roots stretch back to the history of revisionism and an attempt to revise fundamental tenets of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. But it is characterized by a kind of radicalized revisionism, if you will. The early revisionists were involved in political organizing. They were interested in getting state power. They were embedded in the workers' movement. But what became known as Western Marxism, for the most part, because we're talking about the general tendencies here, and there are sometimes minor exceptions to this, this was a form of Marxism that was driven by academics who were disconnected from class struggle, and usually not within political parties, and often even dismissive of the party form, the state form, or for that matter, in certain cases, any form of political organizing. And the core, I think, of Western Marxism is that it is Marxist in theory, anti-communist in practice. And this orientation means that their slogan could very well be summed up as the following: Marxists have hitherto only changed the world in various ways. The point, however, is to interpret it. And within this kind of overall anti-communist academic framework, the 4 retreats that you referenced are it's a proposition that John Bellamy Foster brought up in a dialogue that we had on Western Marxism that was published in Monthly Review. And this captures, I think these 4 retreats capture certain aspects of the Western Marxist tradition, although there are others that I would also highlight. One is the retreat from class. So you abandon a class analysis. The Western Marxists, of course, have largely turned their back on political economy in favor of just doing cultural analysis. The second is the retreat from the critique of imperialism. And I think this is really the core of the matter. The primary contradiction of the contemporary world is either ignored or obscured in various ways. And so there's not a recognition that the fundamental structure of the global order is such that value produced by workers in the global south is siphoned off in order to prop up the global north and especially line the pockets of the imperial ruling class. The third is the retreat from nature, the retreat from materialism, and the retreat from science. So a key characteristic is the abandonment of the materialist ontology of Marxism. So just as they turn their back on political economy in favor of culture, they also attempt to or in many cases simply do, give up on the dialectics of nature and analysis of the broader natural world in order to focus only on the social world. The fourth one is the retreat from reason, because ultimately one of the elements of the Western Marxist tradition is an abandonment of the scientific project. And of course, we should understand science as Marx and Engels did, as Wissenschaft, which is the attempt to elucidate in the most coherent manner possible all of the empirical data that we have while constantly adjusting our framework of explanation to a changing and shifting world. So science in a Marxist sense is fallibilistic. It recognizes that something is true until proven otherwise. It's not science in a kind of objectivist or positivistic manner. And a lot of the Western Marxist tradition, as I'm sure anyone who's engaged with it knows, traffics in obscurantism and endless bourgeois referentiality. So that what is important in the discourse of Western Marxism is not its use value to the workers' movement, to the struggle against imperialism, to building real power. What is important for the Western Marxists is the exchange value of the discourse that they put forth, because they're principally oriented not towards workers, but towards the middle stratum, the petty bourgeois stratum, and more specifically, their individual careers within this petty bourgeois stratum. So what they're focused on is the exchange value of their discourse, right? It's not surprising all of them come up with new concepts and new discourses and new ways of thinking, and they market them in the marketplace of ideas as if they were a way of kind of overcoming the limitations of so-called old school Marxism. This, of course, is just one manifestation of the ways in which the Western Marxist tradition has to be understood in part as a product of the Imperial Theory Industry. Right? Just as there is a music industry or a car industry or a movie industry, there's also a theory industry. And we shouldn't be confused about the bourgeois distinction between high art and culture and theory on the one hand, and the art, culture, and theory of the masses on the other. Under capitalism, all function in terms of certain structural imperatives. And so Western Marxism is one product among others within the Imperial Theory Industry. And its principal goal is to promote the careers and ideas of those intellectuals who identify as Western Marxists, and to push their consumer products, their intellectual consumer products on the market. So coming full circle, then, we can say that Western Marxism is in many ways a fundamental perversion of the real spirit of Marxism and what Lenin referred to as its revolutionary core, and it's radicalized revisionism to such an extent that it is an anti-communist form of Marxism that even at a theoretical level attacks the fundamental pillars of the philosophy of, the dialectics of nature and also Marxist political economy. Carlo, can I ask you just a formal question? Should I turn the light out behind me? Am I too backlit? Or is it okay?
I think is all right. Maybe try and switch off the light just to see if it improves. But I think there was like a reverberation on the screen. That's much.
So that's a quick account, but I'll turn it back to you for follow-up questions.
All right, just a follow-up on this. So when thinking about the category of Western Marxism, I think it is crucial to define it carefully. And so, for example, Perry Anderson, for instance, includes figures like Gramsci and Lukács within Western Marxism, whereas Losurdo uses quite a different framing. So Western Marxism is often portrayed by Anderson for sure as a supposed reaction to the determinism of the Second International, privileging instead the agency of the subject or the role of ideas. These were a more sophisticated approach, basically. But I was going to ask you, isn't this a mischaracterization of classical Marxism, especially when it comes to the dialectics of nature? And in this light, isn't Losurdo's definition, which is much more rooted in the watershed moment of 1917 and the concept of imperialism, a more useful cleavage to be used in distinguishing between these domesticated, depoliticized Western Marxism and one that is instead rooted in the global struggle for emancipation?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
The longer answer is, and this also is to address one of the elements of your first question that I didn't completely get to, and that is the issue of geography. So Western and Eastern Marxism index, in some broad sense of the term, the ways in which the capitalist world has developed to the point of imperialism within the Western world, whereas the principal state building projects for an anti-imperialist world have been in the East. But these are kind of very general reference points. And I think that we need to understand the distinction between the two as dialectical in nature. So it's not as if there's one block of Eastern Marxists, they all think alike, and there's one block of Western Marxists, and they all just follow the same marching orders. In a dialectical analysis, we recognize that these concepts that we have, these categories, don't capture the complexities of material reality in perfect form, and that within these various camps, there are ways in which there's great variation and differing degrees. That said, the most coherent way of framing this kind of concrete abstraction that gives us Eastern and Western Marxism is by examining the socioeconomic base, not the superstructural manifestations. And so the principal problem with Anderson as a Western Marxist is that his approach to Western Marxism is superstructural or ideological primarily. And so, as you pointed out, in the relationship between kind of determinacy and agency, in the case of Losurdo, he goes to the heart of matters because the real driving force behind ideology is the socioeconomic base, not in some mechanistic or reductivist sense, but because it creates the conditions that fashion and compose ideological subjects and ideological communities, and therefore it has an overwhelming impact on the way in which they think about the world, act in the world, speak about the world, etc. And it's ultimately the deep history of imperialism that elucidates more clearly why it is that there's a phenomenon like Western Marxism. So what I would say is that Lenin's incisive critique of the labor aristocracy goes a long way to explaining the revisionism that you see in the early 20th century. And this is because he diagnosed, following on Engels, the labor aristocracy, the fact that workers in the imperial core have benefited directly or indirectly from the wages of colonialism. And although they're exploited, their conditions are superior to those in the global South in general. And in that regard, they're situated at the kind of apex of global labor pyramids. In that regard, these workers have much less interest than those in the colonies in transforming the imperialist world system. In the case of the kind of radical revisionism of the Western Marxists, what you have is more so a kind of intellectual labor aristocracy. So the Western Marxists are, for the most part, the ones that we're mainly going to talk about, is they're academics in the imperial core who teach at prestigious institutions, who are often funded directly by the capitalist ruling class through their foundations like Rockefeller, Ford. Today it's Mellon in particular that plays a very strong role. And they're often supported by bourgeois states, including intelligence services and propaganda agencies. In this regard, the people who are the leading intellectual Marxists of the day, people like Badiou, Žižek, Negri passed away not long ago, Michael Hart, these people, do they really have a vested material interest in transforming a system that is not only giving them all of the economic rewards, but all of the social capital as well. And they will go down in history as the leading luminaries within the bourgeois canon of thought. Why is it that they would want the global South to rise up and transform the structures of imperialism? If they do want that, then that would require actually breaking with the ways in which their ideology is conditioned, not rigorously determined, but conditioned by the structures of imperialism and the fact that they're part of the intellectual labor aristocracy. So I think that Losurdo's diagnosis really goes to the root of matters. Concerning Lukács and Gramsci, I'm glad you brought them up, because there's an entire industry that consists in trying to recuperate certain Marxists who were embedded within the broader Leninist tradition and make them into Western Marxists. The case of Gramsci, I think, is the most flagrant, because it's, to make Gramsci anything other than a Marxist-Leninist is a very, very difficult task. But nonetheless, there's an entire industry in the West, and it's how I was taught Gramsci, that focuses only on the question of cultural hegemony and attempts to not only make him into a Western Marxist, but make him into one of the foundational reference points, as if what he was interested in is just analyzing culture and studying forms of kind of hegemonic cultural production and dissemination without asking the deeper questions concerning political economy, party organizing, the seizure of state power, the Third International for that matter. And so if anyone really knows anything about not only Gramsci's writings, but also all of his militant activism, then he's clearly embedded within the orientation that is aimed to developing socialism in the real world, not the mind of some privileged intellectuals in the West. In the case of Lukács as well, he was very, very embedded within struggles in the East. Lukács is a little bit more of a complicated case, because there are elements of his work that have, I think, been correctly criticized as flirting with particular bourgeois tendencies. And then if you chart out his entire trajectory, he did take certain political positions that I think should be and have been questioned from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. But nonetheless, within Lukács's broader corpus, I think he's a very good example of, again, how we don't want to simply analyze these figures in terms of, it just being there's a camp of Eastern Marxists, a camp of Western Marxists, and then you just classify people and they're all in one or all in the other. Lukács, I think, was primarily oriented towards a revolutionary transformation of the imperial world order in favor of socialist state building projects. But some of his work did traffic in other orientations, both theoretically and practically. So we have to be able to do a dialectical analysis and kind of identify those different elements. Those are at least, some elements of a response.
Now, just a quick follow-up on what you were saying, because we are currently recording from a little town that is probably few kilometers from Livorno, where Antonio Gramsci basically was one of the leading founders of the Italian Communist Party in 1921, and the slogan was "We need to do like in Russia." So. Exactly. To characterize him as a Western Marxism is really a bit far-fetched. I think Matteo wanted to ask you something.
Yes, you spoke about a small group, or maybe not so small, a group of intellectuals who you sometimes refer to as opportunist intellectuals, meaning that they were in exchange for popularity and maybe something more, they were inclined to push an imperialist agenda, but vested with a radical language. So in order to delegitimize actual Marxist movements in the global South, not just in the global South, just they were delegitimizing anything that within Marxism that had any chance or any intent to gain actual power, like as if in a state or in a party. But in your research, I think you've talked about this group of opportunist intellectuals, not just as intellectuals who had some sort of an affinity with the liberal way of thinking, the capitalist interest, but I think you've uncovered a little bit more, something like like actual indirect financing from CIA associated organizations. So like an actual psychological operation from the United States in order to influence Marxism analysis and thought in the West. Can you give us a little more details about what you found out about in this on this topic?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I do think that a lot of the diagnoses of Western Marxism that I've encountered deal with some of the kind of ideological attack on the foundational principles of Marxism. But what I have been engaging with in my research is examining the real political economy of knowledge production under capital, and trying to get to the roots of what are the driving forces behind these particular ideologies. And of course, ultimately, coming back to the first question that you asked, this is a consequence of the imperial world order and is driven by the socioeconomic base and the intellectual labor aristocracy, as I was saying. And so there are ways in which this ideology is organic to the imperial system. But ideologies aren't only driven by the base, and again, not in some mechanistic or simplistic manner, but the way in which goods and services are produced within a society will have impacts on the people who live in that society. It's a pretty basic and fundamental point. But those ideologies are also fashion sculpted and driven in various ways by the superstructure, in the sense of the political legal apparatus and the cultural apparatus, meaning the entire system of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. And so in the research that I've been doing, I think the most logical way of making sense of the relationship between the overall system, the superstructural system, and then the agents within it, meaning the subjects mobilizing their agency, is in terms of a kind of financial state intellectual complex, meaning financial indexing the capitalist ruling class, state indexing the bourgeois states, and intellectual referring to not just academics, but intellectuals in the broad sense of the term, writers, cultural producers, journalists, etc. And what is very clear is that as the United States inherited the crown of the leader of global imperialism in the wake of World War II, and up to the present for that matter, there has been an extremely explicit, well-funded project of developing a version of Marxism that could rival the Marxism of the East, and that could be sold as more sophisticated, more refined, better researched, and ultimately a kind of form of Marxism that is also savvier than the forms of Marxism identified with Eastern Marxism, but again, not geographically, identified basically with actually existing socialism. So that, and this was one of the goals, people in the third world, and for that matter, people as well in the first world, would, when they're looking for their horizons of Marxism, not latch on to, for instance, the work of Fidel and Che Guevara, or Ho Chi Minh, or Thomas Sankara, but instead would read Martin Negri and Badiou and Žižek, if we look at contemporary examples. And the level of financing was quite extensive. I mean, I detail a lot of this in the forthcoming book that's going to be out in December, but just to give you one example, the Rockefeller Foundation, and you need to understand that the US capitalist foundations do not operate separately from the state. The bourgeois state is the state of the capitalist ruling class. And the state is managed in very much the same way as the foundations are managed. And the foundations are managed in order to use kind of the soft power of money to steer culture and other forces in the direction that the capitalist ruling class wants. And the history of the foundations is very tightly integrated into the history of the US state, and in particular, the US national security state. And so, I give many, many examples of this, but the director of the Ford Foundation for years, Shepard Stone, is presumed to have been a CIA agent. And if he wasn't, then in any case, he was in constant dialogue with them, shared information, they funded the same projects, He was a close personal friend of Alan Dulles, one of the longest serving director of Central Intelligence. These are really the same world. What they do is, and this is what bourgeois ideology does, it tries to separate them by saying, well, there's the private world of capital and the public world of the government. But as Marxists, we should be able to say that, well, this is just an ideological distinction. Ultimately, it's the same interlocked world. And one of the best examples of this is the Marxism-Leninism project that was run by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1950s and early 1960s. And they funneled millions of dollars into setting up institutions in Europe in order to do research into Marxism-Leninism. That was the goal, but not in the way that some people would have perhaps hoped. The goal was to understand Marxism-Leninism as a kind of philosophic and scientific enterprise in the East, but then also to shore up as a countervailing tendency to Marxism-Leninism, a version of Marxism that they often called authentic Marxism. So the idea was, we'll return to the source of Marx and read his texts more closely, do a lot of philological work, publish new editions, etc., in order to demonstrate that the Marxists, so-called, who have used Marx in order to undertake projects of building socialist states, have perverted the true essence of Marxism. And what we need to do is then return to this authentic version of Marxism, which is, of course, still a very, very widespread idea. The intellectual kingpin of this entire project was Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse worked for the U.S. National Security State for over a decade in the Office of War Information, in the OSS, which is a predecessor organization of the CIA, and in the State Department. He regularly claimed that he had no relationship to the Central Intelligence Agency, but I have unearthed a very large body of information that demonstrates the contrary. He not only was producing intelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency, but he was even involved in drafting or in developing the drafts for 2 national intelligence estimates, or at least 2. This is the highest form of intelligence within the U.S. intelligence community, right? So we see here that the distinction between what the Rockefellers are funding and the U.S. state is, one that's going to obscure more than it's going to reveal, because the organizational man behind the Rockefeller Foundation Marxism-Leninism project was Philip Mosley. Philip Mosley was also an intelligence operative who had a top secret intelligence clearance and who was a close personal friend of Herbert Marcuse. Their families regularly dined together. And Mosley directed the Russian Institute at Columbia, where Marcuse was hired while he was still working for the State Department, right? So there's no break. There's no clean break between Marcuse's academic work and his work for the U.S. state. And while he was at the Russian Institute, he also continued to be a high-level consultant for the Central Intelligence Agency, participating in the Princeton Group. And the Princeton Group met 4 times a year, and it brought together academics and intelligence operatives to work on national intelligence estimates, with the presence of Alan Dulles, who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So it was the very top of the CIA. This is the man who is the organizational man behind the Rockefellers' Marxism-Leninism project. So this is just one example among many others, but the goal was really to shore up a global architecture with institutions across Europe in Amsterdam, Berlin, Freiburg, and then a second-tier set of institutions that included the Frankfurt School for Social, the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School, as well as the École Pratique des Hautes Études, the 6th section of it, which would become the École des Études en Sciences Sociales, so the School of Higher Studies and Social Sciences, which was the bastion for structuralism and the Annales School, right? So these were all part of a broader institutional apparatus that was promoting globally a version of Marxism that was purportedly more sophisticated and more refined, and that was a Marxism that was returning to its true, authentic sources. So just tying all of those elements together, I think that for a full analysis of Western Marxism, we can not only do a kind of ideological analysis while situating that in broad terms in relationship to the economic base of imperialism, we also have to engage in a refined political economy of knowledge production that demonstrates who was paying for all of this, what were the driving economic forces behind these institutions, behind these publications, and behind the media prominence of so many of these Western Marxists? What were the forces that were really driving them? The last thing that I would say is none of this means at any level whatsoever that these intellectuals weren't themselves exercising agency. The model for understanding this isn't, everything is determined, or there's some CIA agents who have strings and they're just, from behind the scenes orchestrating everyone. These are all pathetic liberal myths regarding how the actual materialist world of knowledge production works. Let's shelve all of those and actually engage in a refined materialist analysis and recognize that what we have is an organic bourgeois system of knowledge production driven by this financial state intellectual complex. And within that larger system, there are intellectuals who are trying to make their careers and in many cases advance within that system. And the way that you advance is not by being a determined ideologue and just doing, what you're told. It's that you give to the system what it wants. And ideally, you actually exercise your agency at a higher level by inventing new and unique forms that allow the system to evolve in directions that were unseen by the system itself. In that regard, we need a dialectical analysis of the relationship between system and subject, rather than relying on these kind of anti-Marxist, undialectical approaches that say, well, everything is determined or you just have human freedom. That's not how the world works materially. Both of these are binary conceptual abstractions that do not cohere to the complexity of the actual material world. So sorry for going on at length on this particular point, but I think it's a really important one, and thank you for the question.
No, it was a great answer. I just wanted to ask you maybe one more question, and then given that there's quite a few people in the audience, we're going to open it up. So I think it's pretty clear that in your idea, one of the main distinction between these two types of Marxism can be found in the way that they sort of like situate with themselves within the anti-imperialist struggle. Let's take as an example a few things that have happened recently. So the recent attack by Israel on Iran, or the military conflict in Ukraine. So it is not rare to see leading figures of Western Marxism, such as Žižek, for example, endorse Ukraine using pretty much idealistic and liberal arguments such as the defense of democracy and self-determination, completely ignoring the material circumstances that led to the conflict, which I think we should understand as rooted in the NATO expansion. Equally, the Western Marxist left has engaged for years in endorsing struggles in favor of civil rights in Iran, which, if in themselves are understandable and correct, are nevertheless directed against a tenet of the resistance against imperialists and not against other states, whose breach of human rights is even more blatant. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, how do you diagnose these, let's say, idealistic framing that some Western Marxists adopt to either go for there's a multiplicity of imperialism, or even argue that there's some imperialism that are worse than the others because they are also non-democratic. And so that's the first question. And the other one is, how should a genuine left engage with polities, such as, for example, Iran, that clearly cannot be taken as an example of a polity that we should aim for, but that in this context could maybe seen as tactical allies, at least?
That's a great question. I'm glad you raised it, because it is true that when you look at the Western Marxists today, the ones who are living, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, they have contributed to a kind of moral and political condemnation of particular states without any geostrategic analysis whatsoever. And so the basic idea is that, each state is condemned because it is, usually Žižek will use terms like fascist. That's how he condemns China, for instance. I know you weren't referring to China, but or Russia as authoritarian, Putinist, etc. And the condemnation, similar moral and political condemnations of Iran. And what, of course, one should notice is that these political and moral condemnations, without a broader geostrategic analysis, segue perfectly with the U.S. State Department logic of democracy promotion, right? So these intellectuals are doing the bidding, willingly or not, of the interests of imperialism. Etienne Balibar is another person that we should reference in this regard, a famous student of Louis Althusser, who also said that pacifism is not an option in the Ukraine and has argued for arming the so-called Ukrainian resistance. And so takes a position very, very similar to Žižek. So you see the kind of continuities. What this approach lacks is a dialectical assessment of geopolitics today. And there's a kind of collapse in which one thinks, well, each state should just be analyzed in terms of particular moral categories. Do they line up on our Western, understanding of democracy or of human rights or things like this? And if there's a correlation between the two, which there generally is not, then we would support them. And if not, then they're to be condemned. With little or no analysis of the very logics of human rights discourse, which has been one of the main ways that anti-communist destabilization campaigns have been run for decades, or an analysis of bourgeois democracy, which is, of course, the best democracy that the capitalist ruling class could buy. So why is it that we'd want to wish that on peoples around the world? Getting, though, to the most important part of your question, which is the second part, I think that from a dialectical and materialist vantage point, one has to distinguish between tactical alliances and a strategic orientation. So it's not just that you look at a state and judge it once and for all from the kind of moral sidelines and say, well, everything they are doing is to be condemned. States don't exist on their own. States exist, all of them, in relation to the global social totality. There's not Iran on its own or Russia on its own. Like, these are complete myths. So how is Russia, how is Iran situated within the overall global dynamic? And most importantly, the struggle against imperialism and the struggle for a multipolar world as a stepping stone towards a spread of socialism in at least an ideal setting. In this regard, it's very, very clear that the US imperial agenda is to destroy the integration of the Eastern world. With the rise of China as the leading self-declared socialist state in the world, China has been integrating itself economically, infrastructurally, with projects of national development that are not Marxist, that are not socialist. Its reasons for doing that, I think, are very astute, and we could go on quite at length about that. But it's a project for internationally developing the global South in order to stretch and eventually break the chains of imperialism. Some people might have criticisms of the way in which they're doing this, but they are focused on socioeconomic base and on global development. And they're working then with non-socialist countries and even anti-socialist countries. But in doing that, I think the overall strategy is to stretch and eventually break the chains of imperialism. And that's what's going on. Like, the reason that the US is freaking out is because this project is successful. And the three principal reference points within Asia for that, of course, are Russia and Iran. If you look at US geostrategy over the last decade or so, it has been recognized that the war against China, I mean, all these wars are constant, but a hotter war against China, it's pretty clear. Attilio Boron, one of the greatest analysts of geopolitics from Latin America, has claimed that all of the war games that the Pentagon has run demonstrate that the war against China is unwinnable. So the Democrats were in office and they decided, well, let's try to kick out Russia and run a NATO-backed war against Russia by using Ukraine as a proxy. That didn't work out so well because that failed. Trump comes into office and is a supporter of the Greater Israel Project. And one of the projects clearly was, well, let's use another proxy, Israel, in order to wage a war against what's perceived as the weakest leg of this kind of three-legged table in the East, and that is Iran. In 12 days, they failed. They're going to continue to try in various ways, but what we have to see is that in the current geostrategic setting, the idea that you would support like human rights or the liberation of women or all of these other things that they trump up, that they did in Libya, that they've done in Afghanistan, that they used in Iraq, all of this is just thin liberal cover for an imperialist project of destroying the integration of the East. So we can see that Iran and Russia tactically, not strategically, but tactically, as a bulwark against global imperialism. So we have to be able to do something that's actually very simple, but is almost never done on the Western left, unfortunately, and that is think two things at once. Recognize that these are tactical allies in a struggle to build a multipolar world, but we don't have to strategically say then, oh, I support Putin and everything that he represents in Russia, or I support everything that's represented in Iran. You could say the same thing for Hamas. And so in that regard, we need a kind of dialectical materialist analysis of the global struggle against imperialism and a distinction between kind of tactical allies and the strategic horizon.
Well, in my opinion, that was a great answer. I think there was a... Do you mind coming here? Yes, please. We've got actually probably the biggest audience for an English-speaking panel so far. So, well, actually, I use this one. It's very popular, Gabriel.
Yes.
I'm flattered and honored.
Not comfortable asking
Hi,
questions
Gabriel.
in English.
Yeah, sorry, I have a bit of a cold. Yes.
You can ask in Italian later, and we will.
Yes, I will be quite slow. Okay, so actually, some of the things that I wanted to ask, I think you covered in this past response, but I think we have explored quite a bit what Western Marxism looks like under like a liberal lens. But I think that there's also like a smaller yet quite loud area in the West, which is like people that pose as communists themselves. And like they tend to critique, let's say, like actually existing socialist experiments or successful revolutions as soon as they succeed. So, like, for example, you might have people that they would say, Mao Zedong was like an amazing leader, but as soon as he died, China is now a fascist state. Or like the Chinese revolutionaries were amazing, but in 1949, they became a fascist state. So as soon as something succeeds, it becomes an enemy. But you critique it from a communist perspective, in a sense. So like they cannot label you as a liberal, but at the same time, you serve the same goals, in a sense. So I don't know if you wanted to explore these a bit.
Wait, can you explain the last part of your question?
Yeah, sorry. So like that people, like they cannot, basically like people that critique you, they cannot say, you're just a liberal, you're just like parroting like CIA points because you're saying that Mao Zedong was a great leader, for example. But at the same time, you eventually you serve the same goal because basically you're just saying that whatever China is doing in the past 40 years is useless and it's like basically a capitalist agenda and so on. So like the end result is the same, but you use a different tactic in a sense.
I think he's referring to like ultra-leftist.
Yeah, like the ultra-leftist.
Okay, because I heard you and I thought you were talking about me, but you're talking about
you.
Okay, like
okay. General you, like
the general you. Okay, I just want to make sure it wasn't me.
No.
Given that you're all in Italy, I think most people hopefully are aware of the incredible and magisterial contributions of Domenico Losurdo. And one of the things that he pointed out very powerfully is that it's very easy to be in favor of struggles when they're losing. The difficult thing is to recognize what it means to build power and actually win. And so a lot of the Western left and Western Marxists, they will celebrate rebellions and uprisings and forms of resistance. For instance, most of them will say, well, Palestine is justified in resisting the settler colonial imperial onslaught backed by the imperial powers. But if you would imagine that the PFLP would come to power and that you'd have a socialist state in Palestine, I imagine almost all of them would cry foul and say, oh, this is authoritarian, this is anti-democratic, et cetera, et cetera. And so what Losurdo points out, and I think brilliantly so, is that the ultra-left and the petty bourgeois intelligentsia often fetishizes the moments of revolt, right? Who doesn't want to have a self-image of, shooting guns on a barricade and, that kind of aspect of revolutionary politics, as opposed to the image of a revolutionary as someone who is an administrator, who is working in a state apparatus in order to get drinkable water to the general population or spread electricity. There's a kind of condemnation of the positive project of building actually existing socialism. And it's something that really needs to be overcome because the goal isn't to fight and lose. and have the glory of having done so, kind of being shot on the barricade. The whole point is not about your individual radicality and your dedication, your tragic dedication to the struggle. The point is to collectively build power in order to win. And winning also means, often in an imperialist world, we have no choice about that. You are fighting the powers of imperialism, and there's only socialism under siege, not socialism set free. And so winning means making tactical compromises. You have to work with the extant world. And so the Chinese, like the Vietnamese, they're very good examples of, they decided to allow for certain forms of capitalist investment to get technology transfer, develop the productive forces, etc. But right now, they have an extremely highly developed society. They've alleviated extreme poverty at a level that no other country in the history of humanity has ever done, with 850 million people. They are doing a project that is actually carrying forth the fundamental principles of sharing the value that's produced by workers with the workers themselves in order to lift up the most oppressed and exploited. Are they doing it absolutely perfectly? Are they doing it according to some blueprint that people might imagine? No, but why should we expect people who are trying to do the impossible, right? That's what building socialism is. You take capitalism and you're headed towards a completely egalitarian society, what people project into the future as a kind of communist horizon. And socialism is trying to square that contradiction. It's trying to take a world and make it into the opposite of what it is. That's going to be a complicated and difficult process. Therefore, we have to be realistic about what it means to do that in the real world, while not then condoning everything that waves the flag of socialism, but just recognizing that there's going to be mistakes. I mean, Lenin said it perfectly. He said, the point is not to avoid making mistakes. The point is to correct them as quickly as possible, right? And, Thomas Sankara often said things to a similar, in a similar vein, claiming that, there are endless mistakes that have been made, but that's how we learn. That's how we advance. That's how we move to the next level.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have a last one, but if you have,
we still have time, so
we've got. Okay. If you
sure?
are shy, I'll carry on.
Okay.
All right. So no, I think this was a great answer, also because I highlights a little bit the messianic, approach of these Western Marxists that also then, as you correctly highlighted, allow you to have some sort of intellectual narcissism because you support perfection. And it's easy to be right by writing the shopping list of the utopian socialist world that you would like to have, and then to say, no, I didn't dirty my hands with anything. I just always upholded the most pure and most I don't know if this makes sense to you, but I wanted to ask you another question on Lenin's theory of the labor aristocracy. So first of all, I think you already clarified this point, but if it was correct to understand it as a theory in which not only the upper stratus of the bureaucracy of certain union and parties apparatus, but also the very working class of the West has been lured into some sort of a class betrayal against, let's say, the working classes of the global South. Because on the other hand, I think that this theory is clearly to be taken with a pinch of salt, because it would be quite ironic to classify blue collars or even, let's say, public school teachers in the US or Italy as part of a so-called labor aristocracy. So that is the first question. And also I was wondering if with the crisis of imperialism and the diminishing availability of surpluses to be recycled in the buying off of whatever we define as labor aristocracy, there are new opportunities for genuine class struggle would open up in the West, or if there is a risk that these sectors of the working class are going to be hegemonized by rising right-wing neo-fascist propaganda.
Great question. The class analysis that has to be undertaken, it needs to be very refined. And there are some political economists who I think have done very good work on this, because it's not the case that workers in the imperial core aren't exploited or don't have degraded working conditions, right? That I think is and should be obvious to most people. It's rather that the structural relations of unequal exchange in relationship to the global South makes it such that the imperial core is drawing on value from the global South that is shoring up the levels of development that you get in the imperial core. And so it can be in certain instances simply the fact that if you're paid in US dollars versus in a currency in the global South, that makes an enormous difference, right? This is one of the reasons that people, will immigrate to the United States to seek, jobs that are crap jobs. They're super exploited. And yet, nonetheless, due to the logics of unequal exchange and the currency exchanges, they make a lot more than they would otherwise. So that's one part, a very, very important part of the kind of global dynamics of what's referred to as a labor aristocracy. But then it's also true that within the imperial core, you have the surplus taken from the global South that is used to some extent develop the imperial core so that you have things like running water, electricity, access to internet, highways, some trains sometimes, things like this. Granted, very limited in various ways, but if you compare that to certain countries in the third world, it's clear that workers also have access to the kind of a broader social value, if you will. Now, that's not to deny, and I think this is where your question is headed, Carlo, is that there is a way in which, particularly with the current imperial dynamic and the ongoing crises of capitalism, there's downward mobility within the imperial core. And it's increasing, there are increasing levels of precarity. In this particular situation, there's also, given the rise of the global South, and in particular, the role of China as a kind of global leader for the global South, the imperialists are not garnering the level of value from the global South that they would like to, right? The wet dream of the capitalists would be to do to China what they did to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, for anyone who knows about the cataclysmic destruction, was, it was raped by the West. It was absolutely brutal. And many political economists have demonstrated that actually the collapse in the Soviet Union was more severe than the Great Depression in the capitalist world, led to global, so many problems, not only economic, but also socially, politically, etc. If you could open up China to that level of, pillage and plunder, that would drive up the profits of the multinational corporations in the imperial core, and that would be fantastic. But that's not what's going on. And it's not just China, of course. There's a broader kind of multipolar world that is federating amongst itself as much as possible in order to push back against the empire. What does the capitalist ruling class do in cases where they cannot leverage the wages of colonialism for their super profits, and they don't have all of the means by which to buy off their working class in various ways? Well, they bring this form of fascist political management that they tend to exercise more in the colonial periphery to the home front. And so quite clearly, what we see within the capitalist world is a process of, and it works better in French than in English, the French call it fascisation, right? It's a process of fascistization. And that's why we have to understand fascism. Fascism doesn't arrive like somebody rings the doorbell and you open it up and the fascist is there. And then, sometimes there are very, very quick changes. But even in the case of Italy, as I'm sure you know, they maintained the bourgeois democracy. They worked with the liberals. They actually made an alliance with the Liberal Party. Fascistization is a process. And what we see in the imperial core is a clear process of fascistization, which needs to be situated and understood as being driven by the socioeconomic base, because there's ongoing crisis of the capitalist world and the rising of the global South. That means that there is a war that is much more intense on the working class within the imperial core. Given that I'm mainly based in the United States, I can say that the Trump administration war on immigrants is an excellent example thereof, because you make a war on the most oppressed, the most exploited members of the working class in order to drive wages down for everyone, right? If you can drive their wages down, it collapses everyone else's wages. While at the same time, through the failed attempt at tariffs, you make a war on the consumers in particular, the middle stratum, who are the stratum, as Michel Kluska said, they're the ones who can actually consume, meaning they're not only consuming to survive, but they can consume, goods in order to, at a level that's above and beyond survival, because the tariffs are, of course, simply demanding the US consumer to pay for them. And those are redistributed via the government to the multinational corporations that are housed in the West. So I think one of the key aspects of class struggle that we're seeing in the imperial core is the rise of fascism, which historically we have to be able to identify as in continuity with the forms of fascism that you saw in Germany, in Italy, and in Japan. Fascism isn't an exception under capitalism. This is what the bourgeois ideology of fascism tries to convince us of. It only happened once in Nazi Germany, and then the US Army came with Lucky Strike cigarettes and bubble gum and defeated them and spread democracy. This is a complete and absolute myth. There were fascist movements in every capitalist country in the wake of the Great Depression. There was a plan in 1934 for a fascist coup d'etat backed by Morgan, DuPont, and the leading elements of the capitalist ruling class in the United States. Fascism is an integral form of political management to capitalism. The issue is that there's a big difference between when liberal modalities of governance are primary within the state apparatus and when the state apparatus goes full on dictatorial. And that can be a kind of night and day qualitative shift that is of utmost importance. And so I don't think we should take a kind of ultra-leftist position and say, oh, well, the liberals and the fascists are just the same. No, they aren't. They agree on the fundamentals, that pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, etc. But the liberals, at least in name and sometimes at a certain level in practice, want to maintain democratic rights at a certain level. And so what we see in the imperial core, and I think this is going to play itself out in the class struggle in the coming years, is an increasing war on the working people that does create enormous, enormous potential for levels of radicalization in political organization, while at the same time you have rising levels of fascism. And every example of fascism that I've studied has been astroturfed, meaning fascism doesn't just arise organically from the working class. It is funded and supported by the capitalist ruling class that owns the bourgeois press and orients people ideologically towards fascism. And one of the key things that fascism does is identifies really important socioeconomic problems. It says to workers, you are downwardly mobile. There are fat cats who are stealing from you. The system doesn't work. The government doesn't work. I mean, that's part of Trump's big platform, is somehow being an outsider, when of course he's not. The problem is that they take those very real socioeconomic problems and they identify false solutions to them. And it's very easy to do this because the fascists remain at the level of kind of sense perception, where what you see is what you get, right? So why don't you have a job, or why are things precarious? Well, it's the Latin American immigrants that are coming here and stealing your jobs, which of course is not true at all, but it's a very facile shift. So you take a real problem and identify a false solution to it. Why is the US downwardly mobile? Well, it's because China is stealing our technology and is running this authoritarian society in which they work their people to death, and that's why they're developing at the rate that they are. All of these myths are basically trying to drive people in a fascist direction, and they own, the capitalist ruling class, the cultural system of production, dissemination, and consumption. And so if you spend a lot of time online, who owns the social media platforms? Who owns all the digital means of communication? It's very easy to identify the drift in the algorithm from you identify a problem and then all of a sudden you end up, very close to fascist solutions. So that's part of the contemporary class struggle. But I'd like to conclude on the most important elements thereof, and that is that this creates an enormous, enormous opportunity for progressive organizing in the broadest sense of this term, meaning not only identify the problems, but identify the real solutions. And the people who are causing the problems aren't the most oppressed and exploited members of the working class. They are not the people of the global South who have seized state power and are developing in very difficult situations state projects that are trying to provide for their citizenry. The real problem is the capitalist ruling class that creates and recreates these problems. And so leftist organizing today, I think, has at least two very, very fundamental tasks. One of them is theoretical and one of them is organizational. We need to engage in theoretical class struggle in order to overcome what Georges Gastaut and many others have referred to as the ideological fracture. There's been a break, unfortunately, a very profound break. When you look back at the 1930s, for instance, or even the 1940s and 1950s, people recognized that the horizon of their struggles had to be socialist. That psychological warfare campaigns, the shoring up of Western Marxism, the theoretical war on actually existing socialism, all of these ideological wars have unfortunately been extremely successful in capturing for certain segments of the population a kind of anti-communist set. It's a dogma. It's just a dogmatic anti-communism where you don't even want to hear about or look at actually existing socialism. We have a lot of theoretical work to do to break through those dogmatic, reductivist, unthinking forms of ideology in order to open up the spectrum of analysis and look much more broadly at how it is that we're going to solve the fundamental problems faced by humanity, which at this point are exterminism, right? We are faced with the very real possibility that Homo sapien will annihilate itself through capitalism and destroy the conditions of possibility for life on planet Earth, or at least a lot of life on planet Earth. So the stakes of theoretical class struggle could not be higher. But at the same time, of course, as Marx, and Engels clearly stated, theory only has real power in the world when it comes to grip the masses, right? We can't solve this problem like the Western Marxists would like us to solve it. And Carlo, I appreciated your references to the kind of purity of one's ideas, right? Where you'd, instead of waving a red flag on the barricades, you'd wave your book and say, just buy this and everything's going to be fine. That's the kind of punchline that you take away from just about any of the writings of a lot of the Western Marxists. Because the second problem is an organizational problem, right? We have parties, unions, organizations that have been deeply infiltrated, extremely compromised, fragmented, splintered, and destroyed in various ways. And this has been a clear psychological warfare operation that, books have been written about, and I discuss in some detail in my forthcoming book. And it has destroyed a lot of the organized left. So in addition to the theoretical problem, we have an organizational problem, and we need to find ways of working collectively together to rebuild the forms of institutional power that are necessary, not simply to fight and resist, but to fight and win. And to do that, we have to bring people in. We have to make tactical compromises. It's inevitable. That is how all of these projects have been done, right? Like the Chinese made their revolution by having a tactical compromise with the national bourgeoisie and the national petty bourgeoisie. You can't keep your hands clean in the struggle. But we have to learn from all of these past struggles. And one of the most difficult things to do, given that you're in Italy, I'm currently in France, but mainly based in the United States, within the imperial core, we need also to be very innovative and very creative in figuring out how to solve this theoretical and this organizational problem, because ultimately we're also organizing the rear guard of history, right? The vanguard of history is the global South that is rising up and making socialism in the real world. The people that are holding back global development are situated in the imperial core. It's not principally the workers, it's principally the imperialist ruling class. But we have to be able to creatively find ways of organizing a working class that has been more indoctrinated, arguably, than any working class, that has been bought off in certain ways by the wages of colonialism and imperialism. And so there's a lot of very innovative work to be done, both theoretically and innovative. And so I guess the final word that I'll say is that I'm excited about the fact that we are collaborating here today, connecting bridges internationally, building and federating between different struggles, media platforms, theoretical work, practical work, because it's this type of broader federation that we're going to have to do if we're going to actually begin building the type of power that is necessary to fight and actually win, which is ultimately the strategy and should be the horizon of all of our struggles.
So I think we can say hello now. We thank you very much for joining us today, and we thank our audiences, which has been numerous so far. So thank you for coming, and I hope we will have another chance soon to talk again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation, and congratulations on your festival, and enjoy the rest of your activities.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Have a nice day. Thank you.